In the summer of 1940, the U.S. military began receiving unsettling reports about an incredibly capable Japanese air superiority fighter. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 was purportedly ripping its way through the Chinese Air Force with little to no competition. Western observers warned the States that watching them fight was like watching a hawk slaughter a flock of chickens. Unfortunately, Western racism meant that the warnings fell on deaf ears. Early engagements with the Zero quickly proved it to be more maneuverable, with a higher climb rate than anything the United States had. At the start of the war with their veteran pilots, the Japanese were mopping up the skies against the Americans who'd never been shot at before. Even when experienced pilots were brought over from the European theater, they were not prepared for the skill and aggression that they faced. The Japanese had prepared their fighters to have a 5-to-1 kill ratio. In the opening months, it was actually 12-to-1. On top of that, the Zero's incredibly long range made it seem like Japan had somehow spread them across the entire Pacific when they only actually had about 500. In the face of all of this, the Americans justified the design by insisting it must be some stolen Western pattern, with Howard Hughes trying to claim after the war that it was a direct copy of one of his own aircraft, but Howard Hughes has said some really dumb shit sometimes. The Zero outclassed every American fighter when dogfighting, but every war machine has its weakness. The West had been terrified of the MiG-25 until we analyzed a stolen one and realized how heavy it was. The United States needed a Zero to examine so they could devise a way to kill it. Japan was well aware of this, and pilots were instructed to destroy their aircraft even at the expense of their own lives rather than letting it be captured. In June of 1942, Japanese aircraft carriers attacked Dutch Harbor, Alaska. One of their Zeros was forced to make an emergency landing in what the pilot thought was a field, but it was actually a swamp. The landing gear caused the aircraft to invert, trapping the pilot permanently. A month later, an American PBY Catalina on patrol spotted the crashed fighter and reported it. Once identified, the Zero was quickly salvaged and repaired to flying condition back in San Diego, where it was flown, inspected, and dissected. The secrets of its weaknesses were finally laid bare. It was immediately apparent that this was no copy of a Western design. The designer had made significant sacrifices in order to make the machine as maneuverable as possible. The Zero was famously hard to hit, but once you did, it burst into flames quite quickly because it lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, meaning that a single 50 caliber incendiary round could destroy it. American test pilots noted that the Zero was fast and agile, but it couldn't be both at the same time. Once it approached its maximum speed, the maneuverability dropped off significantly because the designers had sacrificed hydraulics for saving weight as well. The Zero had an exceptional engine, but it was hamstrung by the same type of float carburetor that would cause early Spitfires to stall during negative G maneuvers. So the American program changed their tactics. Pilots learned to identify the Zero from extreme range, allowing them ample time to prepare their adapted tactics. The Zero's fragility, combined with its sluggish high-speed maneuverability, meant that diving high-speed attacks by much less capable dogfighters were sufficient to change the balance of power. Japan had been well aware that a protracted war with America would be unsustainable in the face of American manufacturing volume and the pace of our technological advancement, which is why they tried to smash our ability to make war in the Pacific all at once. By 1944, the airframe was unremarkable enough to be relegated to a kamikaze role, with 2 Mitsubishi Zero kamikazes successfully taking the aircraft carrier Bunker Hill out of commission, dropping 550-pound armor-piercing bombs through her flight deck before one pilot smashed his aircraft into parked American fighters on the top, and the other attempted to take out the bridge, successfully forcing Vice Admiral Mitcher to transfer his flag and disabling the carrier for the rest of the war. What exactly happened to the pilot of this Japanese Zero? The pilot was 19-year-old Tadayoshi Koga, the native of a small village in Fukuoka Prefecture, Japan. The attack on Dutch Harbor had been going on for 2 days, marking the first ever aerial bombardment of the continental United States. It was intended to serve as a bit of a diversionary attack for their intended surprise at Midway, and they wanted to occupy some Aleutian Islands to launch further attacks. The first attack destroyed the town's radio station and oil reserves before turning to destroying aircraft on the ground, notably destroying 6 PBY Catalinas. Koga and his wingmen shot down one Catalina, then strafed the survivors in the water as they climbed into life rafts. They had banked to attack 2 more parked Catalinas in the water, when Koga had an oil line severed from anti-aircraft fire, forcing him to break off the attack and head for the prearranged ditch location 25 miles away on a deserted island. Koga found what looked like a nice flat field and made the fatal mistake of lowering his landing gear. If he had known that he was touching down on a swamp, he would have made a belly landing. He might not have gotten out of the swamp alive, but he would have had time to set his aircraft on fire as ordered. His two wingmen watched as the aircraft immediately flipped onto its canopy, the landing gear and the soft mud acting as a catapult. When eventually discovered by Americans, Koga appeared to have a broken neck. He was still strapped into his harness, indicating that he likely never regained consciousness after impact. Koga's wingmen now had a decision to make. They were also under orders to destroy any disabled Japanese aircraft. They circled the crashed fighter for some time before apparently deciding to give Koga a chance to crawl out on his own. The Japanese submarine assigned to pick up downed Japanese airmen started a search of the island, but they were driven away by attacks from another Catalina. The first Americans on the scene wrapped Koga's body in canvas and buried him in a shallow, hand-dug grave. When crews returned later with heavy machinery, they dug him a proper one a little farther away, saying the Lord's Prayer over his grave and marking it with a wooden cross. The Japanese government contacted the Navy Department in 1974 asking for the return of his remains, but the location was considered too remote at the time. In 1988, author Jim Reardon, financed by a Japanese businessman, located the grave. 10 inches under the mud, they found the waterlogged wooden cross, then they hit bedrock. No sign of his remains, no sign of the canvas that he was wrapped in. Reardon eventually learned from an Army Corps of Engineers historian that a graves registration unit had cleared the island of Japanese combatants between 1946 and 1949. Koga's body had likely been relocated to a Japanese cemetery in Anchorage or possibly even back to Japan, but no documentation exists.